Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
Let's learn together here. Let's do it. I am
only if we also unlearn.
Okay, yes, that's true. That's the whole point of this thing. I am really excited to be bringing a piece from the brand new edition of Hammer and Hope to the table for us to talk about today. So the piece I chose is called My Time Organizing on Campus Against Apartheid in South Africa. And it was written by Barbara Ransby, who, of course, is a historian, author, activist, professor over at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she also directs their social justice initiative. So she's got a lot going on. She also, as you know, you could probably tell from the title of this piece, was heavily involved in the anti-apartheid movement back in the 1980s. And so in this piece, she shares her experience as a college organizer working on various issues, including transnational and transformative solidarity, and fighting with her comrades against racism, settler colonialism, and apartheid, again, back in the 80s. And she also, through this piece, makes the connection between campus protests against South African apartheid back then and Israeli apartheid today, and what's interesting about what we're seeing and experiencing in regards to that today. So this was a really great and insightful piece, and you know, I love and cherish these opportunities to learn from incredible people like Barbara Ransby. So I'm really excited to talk about this one. Yeah, so where do you want to start?
Yeah, this was a great article, great reflection on her work doing student organizing against apartheid in South Africa, as you said, and how that work is and is not connected to the work fighting for a free Gaza and Palestine today, and fighting against the apartheid and genocide happening there today. And, you know, I really appreciated all the ways that Barbara Ransby talks about the specific things they were doing to build their capacity as organizers across different institutions, and how different that is from today.
Very different work, right?
Maybe, obviously. We have so many tools at our disposal to organize across distances that makes that work. It's not easy, but it's easier.
Yes.
And, you know, organizers from one institution can find other organizers just by searching on social media, the internet, to see what people are up to and what they're doing, how their encampments are going, what are the things they're doing at their encampments.
Right.
And it's easier for national level organizers to help those people craft some shared demands of campuses around divestment. But one of the things that seems like it hasn't changed much is financial disclosures of institutional investments.
Yeah.
They seem just as opaque today as they were in the 70s and 80s. And I think my 2 cents about it is it's probably worse today than it was then, because endowments have grown a bunch over the decades.
Yes.
So it's just as opaque, but there's more money at stake, so to speak. And I didn't mean to rhyme, but I did. But this article, I thought, was a fascinating look at the parallels of her experiences and the demands they had back then, and the things that student organizers are doing today with their demands and their demonstrations and their encampments.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, this is another piece in the canon of helping, I think, organizers reflect on their work, think about how their work today is connected to the work of the past. But you're right, it's never easy. It wasn't easy then, it's not easy now. But yeah, I can't imagine how much more difficult it was to do this kind of work without the ways in which the internet and social media have connected us.
Yeah. Well, the way that she said really briefly was that speakers would go on sort of a tour around campuses, and then they would talk to students who are on that campus to say, well, who's organizing it? Such as you were just here, who's doing the work there? And they would connect via phone numbers that those speakers who were traveling around would share.
Right.
And so that's an entirely different way to get in touch with people.
Yes.
That is a lot more challenging than it is today, and being able to just send somebody a message because you found them doing some work online.
Absolutely. So yeah, I appreciated learning more about that. One of the other things that was really fascinating in this piece was her reflections on, she named them as sort of 3 key ways that the Anti-Apartheid Student Coalition that she was part of strengthened its sense of possibility, as she called it, during her time at Columbia. And, you know, there's so much that we could talk about with each of those three things, but I actually wanted to focus on and talk about her reflections on solidarity and on how the Student Coalition increased its direct outreach to Black students on their campus. So she said this, quote, "While some anti-apartheid activists at the time were fond of the misleadingly triumphant narrative of the civil rights movement's defeat of de jure segregation, Black communities and students knew the persistent reality of racial oppression and violence, especially from the police. So both a class and race analysis increasingly undergirded our work as we learned and debated these issues in meetings and reading groups. We insisted that Black American leadership was important in the U.S. anti-apartheid movement because of a solidarity based on common oppression. It could not be a white-led movement lest it replicate the kind of hierarchies we are seeking to dismantle." You know, and so there's sort of two things there that stood out to me in that reflection. One, you know, the idea of how powerful solidarity is as a connection point in struggle and as as fuel for the fight for movement work. And I think we talked about this a little bit last week too, that, you know, the players and the conditions and the circumstances may look different, but the oppression, to use her example here, is similar and understood. Like we have to recognize that. The other thing that stood out to me in that statement is that we can't replicate hierarchies we're seeking to dismantle. And I appreciated that analysis. I think that also fuels so much of our movements and our fight for collective liberation. None of those hierarchies or the systems of oppression that have existed in our world and have served all of us have served all of us in the ways that they should. They haven't done that. So we just can't replicate them. We've got to dismantle them. So I appreciated her analysis there.
Yeah, that's really great. I think to make sure that we are paying attention to the way that we organize and making sure that we understand the ways that we organize with one another.
Yes.
Is also important. It's not just an ends justify the means kind of situation. Like the way that we get to the end matters too.
Absolutely.
And one of the other things I really appreciated her diving into are the shacks that students built as part of their encampments in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
And what they meant to their movement and their work. So she says, quote, "One prominent tactic our movements shared was to build shanties on campus, makeshift dwellings that resembled the ramshackle housing that Black South Africans were relegated to in most townships. The apartheid government denied Black people access to more permanent housing because by law they were citizens of remote homelands or rural Bantustans, not citizens of South Africa proper, having been effectively exiled and disenfranchised by a series of racist laws. The campus shanties were symbolic, and they served as hubs for organizing."
Yes.
And I love that tactic because it tells a story, and it's a visceral story, especially in juxtaposition of the buildings on a college campus.
Yes.
That story that they tell is a representation of the necropolitics.
Hey.
That's right. I'm going to use this more now that we've talked about it twice
Yes.
and have been reminded of it.
Uh-huh.
The necropolitics of the apartheid regime, it's a perfect representation of those things. It shows you the choices that people are forced to make as a way to say to the institution, hey, we cannot invest in this.
Right.
Look at what our investments in this lead to or are supporting.
Right.
Look what they're doing. Look what our moral obligation is now that we know about this injustice. That moral obligation is to divest.
Absolutely.
And she goes on to say that these shanties were also targets of right-wing organizers and were torn down on different campuses across the country. And then this is also being repeated in its own way today with different groups counter-protesting, so to speak, and provoking and attacking modern encampments. And, you know, what a way to bring that narrative to life too, to bring it back to the necropolitics of the apartheid state. These were organizing hubs destroyed by right-wing opposition. So what an incredible parallel to the destructive necropolitical politics of apartheid South Africa.
Absolutely.
That are doing similar things.
Yeah, I love that you brought that because I think there's so much power in the idea that these shanties, these physical structures are existing in close quarters to our ivory towers. And they are, as you said, visceral. They are visual representations of what is happening, you know, miles away. And so it's, to me, it's a beautiful way to sort of demonstrate, like, we don't stand for this, right? Like this is exactly what's happening there. And this is, this is what we're not going to stand for. So yeah, I absolutely love that. I love that you also brought necropolitics back to the table again. Very good.
I'm not letting it go.
Don't let it go. I love it. That this piece is brilliant. This piece has just so much of her incredible reflections during her time as a student and doing this work. And during that time, she developed relationships with other people who were struggling and who were engaged in movement work, whether that was her peers who were from South Africa, or she talked about this Irish organizer who sold the Irish Republican Army's newspaper just off campus. She also had Palestinian classmates. And one of the things I loved in this piece was she talked about how important and impactful those folks were and how important it was to cultivate relationships with those folks and how important that was to her and her comrades and how much she learned from those folks. And it sounds like all of that contributed to her praxis, right? And the ways in which she showed up. And I would assume, and I know, still shows up to her work. And I think that's a key takeaway from this piece. So, let me share what Barbara mentioned about the relationships that she developed with a couple of her South African peers, because I appreciated the story. So she says, quote, transnational solidarity was also manifest in the creation of personal relationships with our South African counterparts and peers. Mwele Mizi was our age and had already been forced into exile after the Soweto uprisings, but became a part of campus life. We had long, meandering conversations together about politics and the world over coffee, beers, and meals. Thabi Naidi, another exiled South African freedom fighter, became a close friend. Thabi and I were pregnant with our first babies at the same time. We shared fears and hopes for our unborn children, who would go on to play together and reconnect as teenagers in a free South Africa. Our two boys, Jason and Sukumani, were two of the reasons the fight against racism in the U.S. and apartheid in South Africa were so important to us and our youth. And I just think those are beautiful stories, but even more so than that, they're illustrative of a key element of any kind of movement work, and that's just how important it is to be in relationship with one another, to understand one another, to talk about our hopes, our dreams, our struggles, because in so many ways, there's so many connection points there, but they also help fuel the work, as I talked about earlier. And so, I just loved and appreciated her for sharing that with us.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to know those stories, too, with the people that you're working with. Like, who are the people that you're doing this work for?
Yes.
Beyond yourself, I think having your own interest and drive for being in that work and doing it is important, and understanding who are the people around me and who are the people that they're thinking about when they're doing this work, or who maybe they're not thinking about actively, but they're there and they're here organizing on behalf of whatever the issue is, because they know that whatever work they put in here, like, it's going to help whoever it is that they're thinking about, who they love in their own way.
Right. And to gather ideas and all of that as well with those folks. And I mean, anytime you want to grab a coffee or a beer or a meal with me, I'm game to do whatever you want.
True story.
Yes.
All right. Another thing that Barbara Ransby highlighted, I think, is important, is how universities have responded.
Oh, yeah.
To encampments today, which we've talked about here before.
Yes.
But she says, quote, there are a number of similarities between campus protests against South African apartheid in the 1980s and Israeli apartheid today. But one big difference is how university administrations have responded. As we see a polarized country move more toward authoritarianism and away from democratic practices and sensibilities, the managerial class in higher education has followed suit. And I think the important part of this is how so many of us in the U.S. have moved toward authoritarianism and want a need for control of situations and that has happened in the context of the ways our government has chosen to move over the last several decades towards control of the population. And she goes on to talk about how even though the government had made a serious conservative turn under Reagan, there was still more restraint and fewer arrests and cops on campus, which is not what we're seeing today. But I think if you think about the administrators today, they're influenced by the 80s and the 90s and when they started their careers. And those administrators were influenced by the 50s, 60s, 70s, which saw a lot of upheaval and a lot of, I think the context was different. There was Kent State and there was big reaction to that, rightly so. And there were other ways that campus protests had been shut down violently that were still, I think, top of mind for people.
Absolutely.
They experienced them
Right.
in a different way than I think some of the folks who are making these decisions today are aware of those moments. And I think, to me, at least, that's why it looks like they're repeating some of those mistakes that were made in the 60s and 70s, where that feels like there's more repression and restraint and desire for control of speech and of, whatever activities that students want to do.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as I think we've talked about before, I think, I'm concerned about what's to come, especially as we are approaching and some places are in back to school season, and it will be interesting for us to follow what happens across the country on college campuses as it relates to this. One of the other things that she said that stuck out to me was this idea of democratic practices and sensibilities, and I love the words that she chooses that she chose. We've moved away from that, and in so many ways that has hurt us collectively.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately. All right, well, I feel like we're getting there. We're starting to talk about this a little bit. So let's shift our conversation over to application.
Yeah.
How does this piece and our conversation today apply to our everyday lives and our work? For me, one of the biggest takeaways from this piece was in what Barbara Ransby said to open it. She talked about how students and young people have always been on the front lines of the fight for freedom. And we're seeing that right now and what's happening with the occupations and protests to demand an end to the genocide taking place in Gaza, and also to divest from Israel on college campuses across the country. And there have been countless examples of similar kinds of work by young people throughout history on college campuses, but also in the ways in which young people have been a part of movements in other places and spaces throughout history as well. The ways in which young people are activated and engaged in movement work is really impressive and impactful. It really makes a difference in enacting change and in the fight for collective liberation. And that's not to say that it's been easy or it's been the case that if college students or young people protest, change happens like that. But it does make a difference, and it's a really beautiful thing to see young people look at a situation, analyze the situation, and say, no, we don't want this. Things need to be different. We don't believe this, and we want better. We want justice. We demand it. So to see college campuses as incubators of that and places and spaces for that kind of work is really inspiring to me.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's the ways that students can see how things are unfolding.
Yes.
And they're taking their education and they're applying it to understand the situation. And I think it's inspiring. And I think, there's not a lot of student movements where we can look back to in the history that have been large and not reactionary.
Right.
That I think we look back on and are like, well, no, those kids were wrong. There's generally you look back, you're like, well, that's what everybody should have been doing.
Absolutely.
So
on the right side of history. Yes, absolutely. What about you? What have you been thinking for application?
Yeah, my application this week is a quotation that Barbara Ransby and her fellow organizers were inspired by that she shares in this, because I think this quotation still speaks to how we need to understand the interconnection of movements today.
Okay.
So she says, quote, "In those days, we often quoted Mozambican leader Samora Machel, who said, 'International solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains toward the same objective. The foremost of these objectives is to aid the development of humanity to the highest level possible.'"
Yes.
Yeah.
That's it.
And because we might be on different terrains or even in different sectors of the fight.
Right.
But we share objectives with one another, and maintaining that understanding helps us go farther,
Right.
I think.
Yes.
Especially when we understand that we are working toward the development of humanity to the highest level possible.
That's it.
And what are all the things that are holding us back from doing that? And how are we organizing against those things toward our further development to the highest level possible?
Absolutely. To me, that idea of, helping and working towards the development of humanity to the highest level possible is that piece of being on the right side of history. And I want to look back in my life, and I know lots of folks do, and think, what did I do to help us get there?
Yeah.
That is a phenomenal quote. quote. I feel like we've had a lot of quotes, phenomenal quotes here on this podcast. And I'm like, put it on a bumper sticker, put it on a poster. That's great. I appreciate that. All right, well, let's talk about homework now. We've had this great conversation. What do we want to do to continue our learning after we leave the table today? We have certainly read a lot of things by Barbara Ransby over the years, but one thing in particular that I've been wanting to read for a while now is her book, Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century, which is from 2018, so just a few years ago. It's sort of a reflection on the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I feel like that would be a really incredible to read now, all these years later. So that's one thing I want to put on my list of homework. The other thing I'd love to do is just learn more about other anti-apartheid protests that were taking place in the US around the same time, and around the world, I should say. At the same time, Barbara Ransby was engaged in this work and was doing this at Columbia, just to have a better picture of the global work that was happening. It's been a minute since I've sat with and learned that history. So I want to particularly focus on what was taking place at other college campuses and what was taking place at around the world for this. So yeah. What about you?
I agree. I'd love to read one of her books for the podcast. I think Making All Black Lives Matter seems like a great choice for us to bring sometime in the future.
Yeah.
I also think it'd be great to read her book, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement as well.
Absolutely.
Because, who can't learn more about Ella Baker? I think that would be a great thing to do, to read too.
Absolutely. Love it. All right. We've got notching up that book list, that to read list.
Yeah.
For sure. I love it.
Every time.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, this feels like a good place to stop. That was a really incredible reflection from Barbara Ransby. And I'm also really excited for us to continue to bring other pieces from Hammer and Hope, their new addition to the table. But speaking of the table, you're up next time. So what are you going to bring here to our very table in our next episode?
I'm bringing 2 articles.
Hey.
Yep. Cue up the 2 Chainz references.
Yes.
The articles that I'm bringing are connected to one another. They're a 2-part series. They're both written by Mark Engler and Paul Engler. The first is Why Protests Work Even When Not Everybody Likes Them. And the second is How to Make Sure Your Disruptive Protest Helps Your Cause. Okay. They were both published in Waging Nonviolence Online, and they describe the articles as, quote, how movements can understand and harness the polarizing effects of protest.
Wow.
So they seem really great and a really interesting way to take and understand the strategy of protests and why they work and how maybe they don't work sometimes, and making connection to bigger pieces of movement work with protests as a particular tactic of a larger strategy.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. Well, as we, again, continue to see what takes place on college campuses this fall, what we're seeing, there are protests planned at the DNC, right? Like, I mean, protests aren't going anywhere. So the idea of learning more about them and strategizing about them in this way with these 2 pieces, these sound great. So I'm excited to check them out for next week. Thanks for bringing them. All right, folks, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. And you know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok, check us out on YouTube, and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.